When I started out, I was terrible at hand cutting dovetails. If my joints held together at all, they were full of gaps. But strangely enough, I could cut pretty decent dovetails on a bandsaw right from the start. Because a bandsaw eliminates the error that comes with not holding a dovetail saw properly. For example, when you cut the pins half of the joint, you must hold your saw at an angle in relation to the face of the board, and you must cut straight downward. When you cut the tails half of the joint, you must tilt your saw at the proper angle to the side, and you must keep it absolutely perpendicular to the face of the workpiece. With practice and patience, you can definitely learn to hold these compound angles, but not everyone has the time or the desire to learn to cut dovetails by hand. Maybe you rarely build furniture with dovetail joints, but every once in a while you wish you could cut just one or two joints for a special project, and you'd like more of a hand-cut look than many router jigs can produce. Well, today I'll show you the process for cutting dovetails on the bandsaw that worked for me back when I was a relatively new woodworker. And we'll start by choosing our angles. The angles of a dovetail joint aren't carved in stone, but the most common are an 8-to-1 angle for hardwood and a 6-to-1 angle for softwood. You can find a 6-to-1 angle with the carpenter's square. You take a bevel gauge and you place it on the square connecting the 1 and the 6. Or you can use a commercially made dovetail marker. My bevel gauge happens to have dovetail markers built in, both for 6-to-1 and 8-to-1, as well as a 90-degree saddle square. It's by Bridge City Tools. I love this thing. It's not cheap, but I'll put a link below this video if you do want to check it out. Whatever angle you choose, draw it across a scrap of plywood that's about 10 or 11 inches wide, starting about 2.5 inches from the end and sloping your line downward. These measurements aren't critical. You just want the low end of the line to be about 1/2 inch or 1 inch from the end of the board so that your ramp isn't too tall. Now's your chance to practice your bandsaw skills by cutting along that line. Just stay on the waist side and go slowly, leaving the pencil line in place. When you're finished, flip the offcut back onto the larger piece and trace it to create a second identical piece. Since the angle of the second piece cancels out the angle of the first, this second cut is just straight 90 degrees across the end of the board, so you could do it on a table saw or a chop saw. But this extra practice, following a line on the bandsaw, will pay off when you cut your dovetails. You should end up with 2 identical pieces. The edges don't have to be perfectly smooth, but they should be straight and even. Now cut some pieces of 1/4 inch plywood for the top and bottom, attaching them with glue and nails to create a ramp. I recommend thin material for these panels because if the ramp is too tall, especially once you lay your workpiece on top, you may exceed the cutting capacity of your saw. I decided to make a second ramp as well, so I have one for 6-to-1 and another for 8-to-1, so I cover both hard and soft woods. And that's all there is to this jig. So lay out your joint with as many pins as you like. Note that I said pins. We're going to cut the pins half of the joint first. That's what the ramp is for. Many bandsaw tables tilt to the right a great deal, but they barely tilt at all to the left. This ramp tilts the workpiece rather than the table, and it can be used in both directions. So be sure your table is set at 90 degrees to the blade and just lock it in place there. As we cut the pins, there's some things to keep in mind. First, the workpiece lays on top of the ramp along the low edge. The portion that will be cut hangs off the ramp. So, as you cut, you're moving the ramp on top of your saw, not the workpiece on top of the ramp. I like to scribble some beeswax on the bottom of the ramp to help it slide around easily on the cast iron saw table. The sides of the pins slope in opposite directions. If you look at the end of the board, you can see that the blade aligns with only one side of each pin in that first position. You'll cut those sides first, then rotate the ramp and cut the other sides of each pins at the opposite angle. Cut slowly, carefully following your pencil lines on the face of the board. These short lines will seem easy compared to the long lines you followed when you built the jig. A wide blade does make things easier because you can align your cut to the side of the blade by eye before you proceed into the wood. That said, the fast-moving teeth on a bandsaw blade can create a blurring effect, and you may find it difficult to begin your cut in precisely the right place. So, I square the board to the blade, and then I intentionally make a cut off to the waist side of my line. When I laid out the pins, I marked the waste areas with scribbles so I didn't get confused. When the blade contacts the wood in the waste area, I can easily see where it's cutting, and then I can move the blade right up next to my pencil line without worrying about cutting on the wrong side. I'm careful to stop each cut at my baseline, which was drawn across the board to indicate the thickness of the mating workpiece. Then, as I withdraw the blade from the cut, I put some pressure on the side of the blade so that it drags on the waste area. That way, the set on the side of the blade's teeth won't catch and spoil the sharp corners of the pins. After cutting one side of each pin, I rotate my ramp, reset the workpiece on the edge, and cut the other sides. Again, I'm entering and exiting each cut with a bias towards the waste area. To remove the waste between the pins, I have to be sure that I place the workpiece flat on the table so that the narrow side of the pins are facing upward. This will ensure that I don't accidentally cut into the corners of the pins themselves as I nibble away the waste in between them. How close I cut to my baseline depends on how brave I am. If my saw is set up really well, I might cut right up to the baseline. But if my blade is overly aggressive, I could accidentally cut too far. So it's usually best to leave about a 1/16 inch of waste along the baseline and remove it with a chisel later. Because the sides of the pins are angled, there will be a bit of waste left on each side that the bandsaw couldn't get. This is easily removed with a coping saw. If you've never cleaned up a dovetail joint with a chisel, here's an important tip. As you trim along the baseline, don't try to take off two material at once. The bevel of a chisel can produce a wedging effect that forces it past the critical baseline as you chop down into the wood. So pare back your remaining waste a little bit at a time until you have about a 32nd of an inch or less remaining. Then put your chisel just along the waist side of your baseline and chop out the rest. The pins are the difficult part of the joint. Now let's do the tails. The tails are easy. In fact, if you made a mistake on the pins, you can usually make up for it by simply cutting the tails to match. So trace the shape of the pins on the face of your tails board and then return to the saw, this time without the ramp. All you have to do is cut out the waste area between each tail without removing the lines themselves. In fact, I like to leave just the tiniest sliver of wood between my blade and the line on the edge of my tail. If the joint ends up too tight, I can always pare a little more material away with the chisel. But if I cut too close to my line or remove the line altogether, I'm going to have gaps in my joints. The teeth of the dovetail saws do not have any set in them, and that allows them to make laser straight cuts. Bandsaw teeth, on the other hand, are more aggressive. If you try to cut right on the edge of your line, you may find that the sides of the teeth go a little bit too far. That's why I like to leave a little, barely visible sliver of waste in place. Of course, you can use that aggressive tooth set to your advantage, actually using the side of the blade to sand away little bits of material. And I definitely like to leave some of the waste along the baseline between the tails to finish up with a chisel at the bench. As with any dovetails I cut, regardless of the method, I always like to put a little chamfer along the bottom edges of the tails where it won't be seen in the assembled joint. This helps the joint to go together more easily. The first time you do this, your joint is likely to be either too tight or too loose. But if you follow the tips in this video, you'll be able to create well-fitting joints with little practice. If you're still struggling, particularly if your joints are too loose, I recommend watching our video about hand cutting dovetails and carefully applying those tips, particularly about leaving your lines in place and paring small amounts away with the chisel at a time. Even though it's a hand tool tutorial, it will further reinforce the fundamentals that apply to the bandsaw method. I'll link to that video below. Bandsaw dovetails are not faster to cut than handsaw dovetails, but if you lack the confidence to cut by hand, or you do it so infrequently that you just can't develop and maintain the skill needed to do it by hand, a bandsaw and this simple jig will serve the purpose when your project requires a hand-cut look. As the builders behind some of the top brands in the industry, Harvey Machinery has for decades been letting others take credit for their innovation. Now they've developed their own line of saws with the quality and features once reserved only for professional shops. The woodworking world is officially on notice. Harvey Machinery will be in the shadows no longer. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.